In a lively medieval marketplace, filled with the buzz of merchants shouting their wares and the clatter of carts rolling over cobblestones, there lived a man named Jester. He wasn't just any man. He was known far and wide as the stupid fool. To be fair, his reputation wasn't entirely undeserved. Jester had a knack for getting himself into trouble. Whether it was tripping over his own feet or accidentally spilling buckets of water on passersby, he always seemed to leave chaos in his wake. But despite his clumsiness, Jester had one thing going for him: a heart full of kindness. Even when people laughed at him, he never held grudges and always tried to help where he could. On this particular morning, Jester stood near the edge of the market square, holding a small wooden cart that creaked under the weight of poorly made trinkets. These were his creations, crudely carved figurines of animals and knights that looked more like lopsided blobs than anything else. No matter how hard he tried, nobody wanted to buy them. Still, Jester refused to give up. With a hopeful grin, he called out to anyone who walked by, "Step right up. Finest treasures in all the land. Only 2 coins each." But instead of attracting customers, his loud voice only drew stares of amusement. Children giggled behind their hands, while adults shook their heads and muttered about how hopeless he was. One woman even crossed the street to avoid him, muttering something about bad luck. Jester didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it bother him. Instead, he continued bouncing around, trying to show off his wares to anyone who would look. As Jester moved through the crowd, disaster struck yet again. His foot caught on a loose cobblestone, sending him tumbling forward. He flailed wildly, arms pinwheeling in an attempt to regain balance, but it was no use. Down he went, crashing straight into a fruit vendor's cart. Apples rolled everywhere, chickens squawked in panic, and the vendor, a burly man with a thick beard, shouted angrily as he chased after his scattered goods. The commotion caused quite a scene, drawing attention from everyone nearby. People pointed and laughed, some even applauding sarcastically as Jester scrambled to his feet, red-faced and apologizing profusely. "My apologies, good sir," he stammered, bowing deeply to the vendor. "I assure you, I meant no harm. Perhaps these apples are simply too eager to meet new friends." His ridiculous comment earned a few chuckles, though most people just rolled their eyes and turned away. Just then, a hush fell over the marketplace. The sound of hooves echoed through the square, growing louder with each passing moment. Everyone turned to see a group of royal guards riding proudly down the main road, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. At the center of the procession rode Captain Aldrich, a stern-faced man whose mere presence commanded respect. Beside him trotted Thunderclap, the captain's prize stallion, a magnificent black horse with a coat so shiny it looked like polished obsidian. The townsfolk parted respectfully, forming a clear path for the riders, all except Jester, who was still busy picking up stray apples and stuffing them back onto the cart. Oblivious to the approaching danger, he stepped backward, directly into the middle of the road. As Thunderclap drew closer, its powerful stride slowed, sensing the strange figure in its path. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, everything happened at once. Thunderclap reared up dramatically, letting out a piercing neigh that echoed through the square. Jester, startled by the sudden movement, stumbled backward, and somehow managed to grab hold of the horse's reins. In a blur of confusion, he found himself clinging to the massive animal, half-dragged along before finally losing his grip and landing with a thud in a pile of hay. The entire marketplace erupted into gasps and murmurs, unsure whether to laugh or scream. Little did they know, this clumsy encounter was only the beginning of a much bigger story. As the dust settled and the initial shock of the moment began to fade, the marketplace erupted into a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and nervous laughter. Thunderclap, the majestic black stallion, stood frozen on its hind legs for a brief second before crashing back down onto all fours. Its golden eyes blazed with agitation, nostrils flaring, as it let out another sharp neigh that echoed through the square. Captain Aldrich, who had been riding confidently just moments ago, now looked furious as he struggled to regain control of his prized horse. Jester, meanwhile, was sprawled awkwardly in a pile of hay near the edge of the road. His face was red from embarrassment, or possibly from the impact, and his clothes were covered in bits of straw. For a moment, he simply lay there, blinking up at the sky as if trying to figure out what had just happened. When he finally sat up, his first instinct was to look around and assess the damage. Well, he muttered to himself, brushing hay off his shirt, that could have gone worse. But it hadn't gone well enough to escape notice. Captain Aldrich dismounted swiftly, his polished armor clinking with every step as he strode toward Jester. The crowd parted silently, creating a wide circle around the two men. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some expected the captain to draw his sword right then and there. Others thought he might simply order Jester arrested without a word. Either way, no one envied the fool's position. "What is the meaning of this?" Aldrich barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. He pointed an accusatory finger at Jester, who scrambled to his feet, brushing more hay off his pants. "Explain yourself, peasant. How dare you interfere with a royal guard steed?" Jester opened his mouth to respond but quickly realized he didn't have a good answer. Instead, he stammered nervously, waving his hands in front of him, as if trying to physically push away the accusation. "Interfere? Oh no, sir, I assure you, interference was not my intention. You see, the ground. It attacked me. Yes, the ground itself conspired against me. And before I knew it, your glorious horse appeared, and—" "Enough," Aldrich snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. His face was turning redder by the second, his patience wearing thin. "Do you take me for a fool? This is blatant disrespect to the crown and to my mount. Thunderclap is no ordinary horse. He is trained for battle, loyal to the king, and deserves nothing less than reverence." At the mention of Thunderclap's name, the great stallion snorted loudly, as if agreeing with its master. Jester glanced over at the horse, still standing tall and proud despite the earlier chaos. To his surprise, Thunderclap didn't seem angry anymore. In fact, its ears were perked forward, almost as if it were listening intently to the conversation. Jester tilted his head curiously, wondering why such a magnificent creature would pay any attention to someone like him. But Captain Aldrich wasn't interested in pondering the horse's behavior. "You will come with me," he declared firmly, grabbing Jester by the arm. "This matter will be dealt with properly." Before Jester could protest or trip over his own feet again, the captain signaled to two nearby guards, who stepped forward to escort the hapless fool away. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jester was led off, muttering apologies and excuses under his breath. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered about how fitting it was that the clumsy man had finally gotten into real trouble. A few even cheered, glad to see justice served for all the times Jester had caused disruptions in the marketplace. As they marched through the square, Jester couldn't help but glance back at Thunderclap one last time. The horse met his gaze briefly, its golden eyes glinting in the sunlight. For a fleeting moment, Jester felt something strange, a connection, perhaps, or maybe just his imagination running wild. Whatever it was, it gave him a small spark of hope amidst the overwhelming sense of dread building in his chest. Little did anyone know, this seemingly random collision between a foolish man and a royal horse was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything, for better or worse. The heavy iron door of the dungeon clanged shut behind Jester with an echoing thud, leaving him in near-total darkness. The faint light from a flickering torch on the wall cast eerie shadows across the damp stone floor, doing little to brighten the gloomy cell. A cold draft seeped through cracks in the walls, sending shivers down his spine. For a moment, Jester simply stood there, staring at the barred door as if hoping it might magically swing open and let him out. When that didn't happen, he sighed deeply and plopped down onto the hard wooden bench that served as both bed and seat. "Well," he muttered to himself, rubbing his arms to ward off the chill. "This is certainly one way to spend an afternoon." His voice echoed slightly in the empty space, making him feel even lonelier than before. He tried to stay positive, reminding himself that things could always be worse, though at the moment, it was hard to imagine how. Still, Jester wasn't the type to dwell on misfortune for too long. Instead, he began talking aloud, recounting the events of the day as though narrating a story to an invisible audience. And so, our hero, me, obviously, found himself face to face with the mighty Thunderclap. What a magnificent creature! Surely no horse has ever been so noble or so shiny. He paused, frowning thoughtfully. Though I must admit, I didn't expect quite so much rearing and neighing. Perhaps I should have bowed first. Yes, next time. I'll remember to bow. His rambling monologue was interrupted by the sound of hooves pounding against wood somewhere far above. It was faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud that seemed oddly familiar. Jester tilted his head, listening intently. Could it be? Was Thunderclap causing trouble again? The idea made him smile despite his predicament. Maybe the horse hadn't forgotten about their brief encounter after all. Back in the royal stables, Thunderclap was indeed acting strangely. Normally calm and obedient, the stallion now paced restlessly in its stall, ignoring the buckets of oats set out for it. Its handlers exchanged worried glances as they tried, and failed, to calm the agitated animal. No matter what they did, Thunderclap refused to settle down. It pawed at the ground, tossed its head, and let out low whinnies that carried through the stable like mournful cries. Captain Aldrich arrived shortly after hearing reports of the horse's behavior. "What's going on here?" he demanded, striding into the stable with his usual air of authority. One of the grooms stepped forward nervously, wringing his hands. "Sir, we don't know what's wrong with him. He won't eat, won't listen to commands. It's like he's searching for something." Aldrich frowned, approaching Thunderclap cautiously. The horse quieted momentarily when it sought its master but soon resumed its restless movements. Aldrich ran a hand along the sleek black coat, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath. Something was definitely off, but he couldn't pinpoint what. As he stood there pondering, his thoughts drifted back to the clumsy fool from earlier. Could there be some connection between Jester and Thunderclap's odd behavior? The idea seemed absurd, yet Aldrich couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the two incidents were somehow linked. Meanwhile, back in the dungeon, Jester had stretched out on the uncomfortable bench, staring up at the ceiling. Despite the grim surroundings, his mind wandered freely, imagining fantastical scenarios where he escaped, befriended Thunderclap, and became a legendary hero. Perhaps, he mused aloud, there's more to this whole stupid fool business than meets the eye. Maybe I'm destined for greatness, or at least for not getting trampled by horses anymore. He chuckled softly at his own joke, unaware that his life was about to take a turn neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. Far away in the palace, someone else was already intrigued by the peculiar events of the day, and she had plans of her own. Night had fallen over the kingdom, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets and wrapping the palace in an air of quiet mystery. Inside the grand halls, most of the royal household had retired for the evening, their footsteps replaced by the soft rustle of curtains swaying in the breeze. But not everyone was asleep. Lady Seraphina, the king's youngest daughter, sat by her window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard. Her thoughts were restless, swirling around the strange tale she'd heard earlier that day. A story about a clumsy fool, a royal horse, and an incident that had left the entire marketplace buzzing. Seraphina had always been different from her siblings. While they focused on politics, diplomacy, and preparing to rule, she found solace in simpler things, especially animals. She spent hours in the stables, caring for horses, feeding birds, and even tending to injured creatures brought in from the forest. To her, animals weren't just beasts. They were companions with feelings and stories of their own. So when word reached her about Thunderclap's unusual behavior after meeting Jester, her curiosity was piqued. Determined to uncover the truth, Serafina slipped out of her chambers, careful not to wake her attendants. Dressed in a plain servant's gown, and carrying a lantern dimmed to avoid drawing attention, she made her way through the winding corridors toward the dungeons. The guards stationed outside barely glanced at her as she passed. They assumed she was just another maid fetching supplies or delivering messages. No one suspected that the princess herself would venture into such a place. When she arrived at Jester's cell, she hesitated for a moment, peering through the bars to get a better look at the man inside. At first glance, he didn't seem particularly remarkable. He lay sprawled awkwardly on the wooden bench, snoring softly with his mouth slightly open. His clothes were rumpled, and bits of hay still clung to his sleeves. For all intents and purposes, he looked exactly like the stupid fool everyone described him as. But something about him intrigued Serafina. Perhaps it was the faint smile playing on his lips, as though he were dreaming of adventures far greater than his current predicament. Or maybe it was the way he carried himself, even in this grim setting. There was a certain lightness to him, as if nothing could truly weigh him down. Whatever it was, it compelled her to step closer. "Excuse me," she whispered, rapping gently on the iron bars. Jester stirred but didn't wake. She tried again, louder this time. "Hello? Are you awake?" With a startled snort, Jester bolted upright, nearly falling off the bench in the process. Blinking blearily, he squinted at the figure standing outside his cell. For a moment, he thought he was seeing a ghost. The pale glow of the lantern illuminated her delicate features, making her appear almost otherworldly. Who goes there?" he stammered, clutching the edge of the bench for support. "It's all right," Serafina replied softly, lowering the lantern so he could see her face more clearly. "I'm here to talk to you." Jester blinked again, his confusion giving way to awe as he realized he wasn't speaking to a spirit, but a real person, and a beautiful one at that. "The lady in the dungeon. Surely I've hit my head harder than I thought," he muttered, rubbing his temples dramatically. Then, remembering his manners, or what little he had, he bowed deeply, nearly toppling forward in the process. "Forgive me, Milady. I did not mean to offend your presence with my clumsiness." Serafina stifled a laugh, charmed by his antics despite herself. "You don't need to bow, and you haven't offended me. I came because I wanted to hear your side of the story, about what happened with Thunderclap." At the mention of the horse, Jester perked up immediately. "Ah, Thunderclap. What a magnificent creature. Truly, I meant no harm. I swear it on my mother's favorite spoon. It was all just a terrible misunderstanding. One moment I was admiring the ground, and the next I was, well, acquainted with the horse." His explanation grew increasingly exaggerated as he went on, complete with wild hand gestures and sound effects. By the time he finished, Serafina was laughing quietly, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're certainly unlike anyone else I've met," she admitted. "But tell me honestly, do you think you have a special connection with animals?" Jester paused, considering the question seriously for once. "Well, I've never given it much thought, Milady. But if Thunderclap is any indication, perhaps I do have a knack for making friends, even the four-legged kind." Serafina smiled, a plan forming in her mind. If Jester truly had a gift, it might explain why Thunderclap had acted so strangely. And if that were the case, then keeping him locked away would be a waste, not just of his potential, but of the bond he seemed to. The next morning, Jester was roused from his uneasy sleep by the sound of keys jingling outside his cell. For a moment, he thought it might be another guard coming to check on him, or worse, take him away for some unknown punishment. But when the door creaked open, he saw Lady Serafina standing there, her face calm but determined. She carried a bundle of clothes under one arm and held the lantern in the other. "Good morning," she said with a small smile. "I hope you slept well." Jester blinked groggily, trying to process the sight of the princess visiting him again. "Milady," he exclaimed, scrambling to his feet and nearly tripping over the bench in his haste. "You've returned." Am I dreaming? Because if I am, this is by far the nicest dream I've ever had." Serafina chuckled softly, clearly amused by his antics. "No, you're not dreaming. Now get dressed quickly. We don't have much time." She handed him the bundle of clothes, which turned out to be simple servant's attire, a tunic, trousers, and sturdy boots. "We're going to the stables." Jester stared at her, wide-eyed. "The stables?" With thunderclap. His voice rose an octave, equal parts excitement and panic. "But won't Captain Aldrich be furious? Or will he arrest me again?" "Don't worry," Serafina assured him. "I'll handle Aldrich if he finds out. Right now, we need to see how Thunderclap reacts to you. If there really is a connection between you two, it could change everything." With that, Jester didn't need any more convincing. He changed into the clothes as quickly as his clumsy hands would allow, muttering apologies every time he fumbled with the laces or dropped something. Once he was ready, Serafina led him through the dimly lit corridors, sticking to shadowy paths to avoid being seen. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs lining the floors. When they reached the stables, the air smelled of hay and leather, mingling with the faint musk of horses. The stable hands were busy tending to their tasks, none paying attention to the pair slipping inside. Thunderclap stood in its stall, still restless but quieter than the night before. As soon as Jester stepped into view, however, the horse's ears perked up. Its golden eyes locked onto him, and it let out a soft whinny, almost like a greeting. "Well, well," Jester murmured, approaching cautiously. "It seems we meet again, my shiny friend." He extended a hand slowly, half expecting the horse to shy away. Instead, Thunderclap leaned forward, pressing its velvety nose against his palm. Jester grinned, his earlier nerves melting away. "See, we're old pals now." Serafina watched the scene unfold with growing astonishment. She'd expected some level of familiarity between them, but this was extraordinary. Thunderclap, usually so aloof and disciplined, seemed utterly at ease around Jester. It nuzzled him affectionately, even allowing him to stroke its neck without protest. Encouraged by the bond forming before her eyes, Serafina decided to push further. "Do you think you can ride him?" she asked, glancing at Jester. "Just for a moment, to see how he responds." Jester froze, his grin faltering. "Ride him? Oh no, milady, I couldn't possibly. What if I fall off? Or worse, what if I offend him somehow?" "You won't," Serafina said firmly, though her tone remained gentle. "Trust me. And trust yourself. You've already proven you have a way with him. Just try." Taking a deep breath, Jester nodded. With Serafina's help, he climbed awkwardly onto Thunderclap's back, gripping the horse's mane tightly as if afraid to let go. At first, the stallion shifted uneasily beneath him. But then, sensing no fear or tension from Jester, it settled down. Slowly, carefully, Jester urged the horse forward. To everyone's amazement, including his own, he stayed seated, moving in sync with Thunderclap's powerful strides. Serafina clapped her hands together, unable to contain her excitement. "This is incredible. You truly do have a gift, Jester. Not just with Thunderclap, with all animals, I suspect." For the first time in his life, Jester felt a sense of purpose. Maybe he wasn't just a clumsy fool destined to stumble through life causing chaos. Maybe, just maybe, he had something valuable to offer after all. And as Thunderclap carried him gently around the stableyard, he allowed himself to believe it, even if only for a little while. Word of Jester's secret visits to the stables, and his uncanny connection with Thunderclap, didn't stay hidden for long. It only took a few days before Captain Aldrich caught wind of the rumors. At first, he dismissed them as nonsense, assuming someone was exaggerating or playing a prank. But when one of the stable hands confirmed that Lady Serafina had indeed been seen sneaking around with the stupid fool, Aldrich's suspicions turned into outright fury. How dare she defy protocol like this? He muttered under his breath, pacing back and forth in his quarters. The idea of a common peasant mingling with royalty, and worse, handling the king's prized horse, was an insult to everything Aldrich stood for. He prided himself on discipline, order, and loyalty to the crown. To him, Jester represented everything that went against those values: chaos, incompetence, and sheer absurdity. Determined to put an end to the situation, Aldrich stormed into the throne room, where the king was reviewing documents with his advisors. Bowing stiffly, he launched into a passionate tirade about Jester's supposed manipulation of the princess and misuse of royal resources. "Your Majesty," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall, "this cannot continue. That man is no more than a troublemaker, a disgrace to our kingdom. If we allow him to remain in the palace, it will undermine your authority and tarnish the honor of the royal guard." The king raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but not yet convinced. "Captain Aldrich, are you certain this isn't simply jealousy speaking? My daughter has always had a fondness for animals, and if this Jester truly has a gift, perhaps it could benefit us." "Benefit us?" Aldrich spluttered, momentarily losing his composure. "He's a fool who nearly caused Thunderclap to bolt in public. What good can come from trusting such a man?" Before Aldrich could argue further, Serafina entered the room, her chin held high and her expression calm but resolute. She had anticipated Aldrich's accusations and was prepared to defend Jester. Stepping forward, she addressed her father directly. "Father, please hear me out. I admit I brought Jester to the stables, but only because I wanted to test his abilities. What I discovered was remarkable. He has a natural talent for connecting with horses, even ones as temperamental as Thunderclap. Under his care, the stallion has become calmer and more responsive than ever before." Aldrich scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your Highness, forgive me, but this is preposterous. A clumsy oaf teaching techniques to the royal cavalry. It's laughable." Serafina ignored him, focusing instead on her father. "Think about it, father. Imagine what Jester could do for our riders and their mounts. His methods may seem unconventional, but they work. Isn't that worth considering?" The king leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. He trusted his daughter's judgment, but he also understood the importance of maintaining tradition and respect within the ranks. After a moment of silence, he nodded slowly. "Very well. We shall settle this matter once and for all. There will be a trial by combat, a mounted duel between Captain Aldrich and Jester. If Jester proves himself worthy, he will earn his freedom and a place among the royal stables. If not—" He trailed off, leaving the consequences unspoken but clear. Aldrich smirked triumphantly, confident that victory would be his. Jester, on the other hand, looked pale and wide-eyed, as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. "A duel? On horseback? Against you?" he squeaked, pointing at Aldrich. "Surely there's been some mistake. I'm not exactly known for my swordsmanship." Serafina placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fight him, Jester. You just have to show everyone what you're capable of. Trust yourself and trust Thunderclap." Though still terrified, Jester nodded weakly. As the date of the duel approached, whispers spread throughout the kingdom, drawing crowds eager to witness the spectacle. Some came to cheer for Aldrich, believing he would easily crush the foolish upstart. Others were curious to see whether Jester's bond with Thunderclap might actually give him a chance. Either way, the stage was set for a clash that no one would soon forget. The day of the duel dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting golden rays over the kingdom. The entire town had gathered in the royal arena, a sprawling field surrounded by wooden stands packed with spectators. Nobles sat in shaded pavilions adorned with silk banners, while commoners perched on benches or stood shoulder to shoulder along the edges, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the action. The air buzzed with excitement, punctuated by occasional cheers and jeers as people placed bets on who would emerge victorious. At one end of the arena stood Captain Aldrich, resplendent in his polished armor, his sword gleaming at his side. Thunderclap waited beside him, its sleek black coat brushed to perfection, muscles rippling beneath its skin. Aldrich exuded confidence, every movement deliberate and commanding. He had trained for years to master mounted combat, and he saw this duel as nothing more than an opportunity to prove his superiority once and for all. On the opposite side of the field, Jester fidgeted nervously, tugging at the borrowed tunic Serafina had provided for him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the leather bracers around his forearms, though they did little to make him look like a warrior. Beside him, Thunderclap seemed unusually calm, almost as if it were trying to reassure its rider. "You're awfully brave today," Jester muttered to the horse, patting its neck gently. "I wish I could borrow some of that courage." Serafina approached him moments before the duel began, her expression soft but firm. "Remember what we practiced," she whispered, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Stay light on your feet, keep your balance, and let Thunderclap guide you. You don't have to win, just show them what you're capable of." Jester nodded, swallowing hard. "Right. No pressure, then." He forced a shaky smile, though his knuckles turned white, as he gripped the reins tightly. A trumpet blast signaled the start of the duel. Both riders spurred their horses forward, charging across the field toward each other. Aldrich moved with precision, his lance aimed directly at Jester's chest. To the crowd, it seemed impossible that the clumsy fool could evade such a skilled opponent. Yet somehow, Jester leaned back instinctively, letting Thunderclap weave gracefully out of harm's way. The lance whistled past him, missing by inches. The audience gasped in unison, unsure whether to cheer or laugh. Aldrich scowled, wheeling his horse around for another pass. This time, he came in faster, angrier, determined not to be humiliated again. But Jester surprised everyone, including himself, by ducking low over Thunderclap's neck, using the horse's speed and agility to dodge yet another blow. As the duel continued, it became clear that Jester wasn't fighting in the traditional sense. Instead of meeting Aldrich head-on, he relied on quick reflexes and clever maneuvers, staying just out of reach while keeping Thunderclap perfectly in sync with his movements. The horse responded to his slightest touch, turning sharply or leaping aside whenever danger loomed. Even Aldrich couldn't deny the strange harmony between man and beast. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Frustration mounted with each failed attempt to strike Jester down. Finally, in a desperate bid to end the match, Aldrich abandoned caution entirely. He charged recklessly, aiming not just for Jester, but for Thunderclap itself, hoping to unseat them both. Panic surged through the crowd as they realized the captain might actually injure the prize stallion. But Jester reacted without thinking. Guided by pure instinct, and perhaps a bit of luck, he pulled Thunderclap into a sharp pivot, positioning himself directly in Aldrich's path. As the two horses collided, Jester reached out, grabbing hold of Aldrich's mount and yanking it sideways. The force sent both riders tumbling to the ground, narrowly avoiding disaster. For a moment, silence fell over the arena. Then, realizing no one was hurt, the crowd erupted into cheers. Even Aldrich, sprawled awkwardly in the dirt, couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the fool who had saved them all, even him, from potential catastrophe. Though technically neither man had won outright, Jester's bravery and selflessness left no doubt in anyone's mind. He was far more than just a stupid fool. The king rose from his seat in the royal pavilion, surveying the scene below with a thoughtful expression. The arena was alive with noise, cheers, laughter, and even some scattered applause for Jester's unexpected heroics. Though the duel hadn't ended in a clear victory for either man, it was obvious to everyone that something remarkable had just occurred. Even Captain Aldrich, still brushing dust off his armor as he stood up, couldn't deny that Jester had proven himself in ways no one anticipated. "Enough," the king called out, raising a hand to silence the crowd. His voice carried authority, and within moments, the arena fell quiet. He descended from the pavilion, walking toward the center of the field where Jester and Aldrich now stood side by side, albeit awkwardly. Jester looked pale but relieved, while Aldrich wore an unreadable mask, though his clenched jaw hinted at lingering frustration. "Captain Aldrich," the king began, addressing him first. "You have served this kingdom faithfully for many years, and your skill is unmatched. However," he paused, glancing meaningfully at the scattered debris left behind by the reckless charge. "Today, you allowed your pride to cloud your judgment. A true leader must know when to yield, not only to protect themselves but also those around them." Aldrich bowed his head stiffly, accepting the reprimand without argument. For all his flaws, he valued honor above all else, and deep down, he knew the king spoke the truth. Turning to Jester, the king's tone softened. "And you, Jester, you've shown us that courage comes in many forms. You may lack formal training or noble blood, but you possess something far rarer, a gift for understanding creatures others see as mere tools. Your actions today saved not only yourself but my finest horse, and perhaps even Captain Aldrich." Jester blinked, stunned by the praise. "Your Majesty," he stammered, bowing so deeply he nearly toppled over again. "I assure you, I never meant to cause trouble. If anything good came from this, it was entirely thanks to Thunderclap. Without him, I'd probably still be hiding in the hay." The crowd chuckled warmly, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine affection. They had witnessed firsthand that beneath Jester's clumsiness lay a kind heart and a unique talent, one that deserved recognition rather than ridicule. With a nod, the king announced his decision. "From this day forward, Jester will serve as the official trainer and caretaker of the royal stables. You will work alongside Captain Aldrich to improve our cavalry's bond with their horses. And should anyone question your place here," he cast a pointed look at Aldrich, who straightened slightly, "remind them that bravery and humility often outweigh strength and tradition." The proclamation was met with thunderous applause. Serafina beamed proudly from the sidelines, knowing her instincts about Jester had been right. As for Aldrich, he stepped forward reluctantly, extending a gauntleted hand toward Jester. "Truce," he offered gruffly, though there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. Jester hesitated for a moment before shaking the captain's hand enthusiastically. "Of course. Though if we're being honest, I think Thunderclap deserves most of the credit." A stallion snorted loudly as if agreeing, earning laughter from the crowd. In the weeks that followed, life in the kingdom changed, for Jester especially. No longer dismissed as a stupid fool, he became a beloved figure, admired for his kindness and ingenuity. Under his guidance, the royal horses grew calmer and more responsive, improving the cavalry's performance significantly. Even Aldrich warmed up to him, albeit slowly, recognizing that Jester's unconventional methods produced results. As for Thunderclap, the bond between horse and trainer only grew stronger. Together, they inspired countless stories of loyalty and redemption, proving that greatness can come from the unlikeliest places. And so, what began as a clumsy collision in the marketplace ended as a tale of triumph, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest acts of courage can change the course of destiny.